Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to give you a very long and thorough talk. I won't. All the same, I'll try at least to touch upon the features of these changes in Eastern Europe from the vantage point of some ideas we had, some ideas we still have, and some ideas we are about to abandon. When I say we, I mean dissidents. I mean those people who, well, tried to think about the changes before the changes occurred. A month ago in Prague, I gave a talk in a conference called The Failure of Dissidents. Well, perhaps the title is too brutal. Still, I'd like to tell you a few words about the fate that befell the main ideas of dissidents. Which were these main ideas? The first, of course, were human rights. The second was civil society. And the third is more difficult to summarize, but I'd like to call it the exclusion of the third way. Well, all these ideas, especially the first two, about which I won't talk for a very long time, I'll talk especially about the third one, were ideas characteristic for people who didn't think in terms of state, citizenship, and liberty. To think in terms of human rights and civil society is to think in a capacity of human beings defenseless, unprotected by civilization, by institutions, by order and by law. The idea of human rights and the idea of civil society, excellent ideas as they might be, and they are, I think, are characteristic ideas of people who don't trust any institutional tradition, any legal order, and any state authority. These were basic ideas of people outside the institutional tradition of European society, but people who were desirous of preserving, well, what was nice and beautiful and pleasant and pleasing about European civilization. Art, culture, thinking, plurality, diversity, and, well, a load of fun. Now, all these ideas were alive and strong and inspiring at the moment when the changes, the political changes in Eastern Europe have really occurred. And when my friends have been at the helm, as it were, of the revolutionary movement in '88, don't forget '88, it hadn't begun in '89, it was in '88 now, when it all began. So in '88, '89, '90, when they found themselves at the helm of the revolutionary movement, and when reality had asked them the questions, well, whither now, Eastern Europe, well, regarding institutional order, economy, etc., well, we responded by saying we won't choose a way between Eastern socialism and Western liberal capitalism, but decidedly and definitely, well, we'll go the Western way. Well, the question which I'll address very briefly now, well, did we or didn't we? Did we go the Western way or didn't we? Well, in my modest opinion, we did not. And I shall try to show you how and why. It's a huge task. And of course, the answer will be fragmentary and elusive only. Well, actually, I don't know how many of you know an excellent booklet written by the brilliant Hungarian economist János Kornai, which has different titles in different languages, but anyway, it's a tract, a pamphlet, a passionate plea for a free society, in a way, a heir to another very famous book written in other very stormy times by our deceased friend and mentor, Friedrich August von Hayek, in 1944, that was called The Road to Serfdom. And János Kornai wrote a book which wanted to show us the road to liberty. Well, he said there, very clearly, in a book, there are many features I don't agree with, but what I'm going to quote, I do agree with. He said, if we want to create a market economy based on private property, we must have two kinds of economy to start with. State economy, where democratic rules will prevail, that is, accountability, transparency, and democratic control exercised by the representatives of the people. That's democracy, right? And we must have another economy, the market economy based on private property, where liberal rules will prevail, supply and demand, and so on. But what is the most important here, that a clear dividing line between the two shall prevail. Because you cannot privatize if it's not clear what does and what does not belong to the state, and what does and what does not belong to private owners. Because János Kornai was, as I am now, aware of the danger that a third shape of ownership can exist, about which no known technique in the experience of humankind exists. What to do about it? Well, what has happened in Eastern Europe? And here, there's no difference between Albania and Hungary, Tajikistan and Czechoslovakia, Moldavia and Eastern Germany, is that a grey zone of neither state nor private ownership had been created. And this grey zone, which I'm going to describe to you, is the basis of power for those political forces that now dominate Eastern Europe. The technique was very simple. State enterprises, economic organizations of a kind, which didn't participate fully in the old game of socialist planning, have been transformed into all sorts of companies, limited liability companies, or incorporated companies or others, without really passing into the private sector. Most owners of economic organizations in Eastern Europe are state banks. Their boards are controlled by political groups, but at the same time, legally, these economic organizations are not any longer state enterprises, therefore their parliamentary democratic control is impossible. So we don't enjoy the advantages of democratic control, And we don't enjoy the advantages of capitalist economy either. And I'll quote to you a very controversial example of recent Hungarian vintage, which will summarize in a symbolic way, because I don't have time for a sociological description, what is at stake here. The Hungarians present here will know what I'm talking about. It's about an enterprise called Antenna Hungária Limited. Well, this is a limited liability company which is about to broadcast satellite TV programs to the Carpathian Danube Basin, to the 15 million Hungarians living inside and outside the borders of Hungary, and the thing has happened thus. 300 million florins from the state budget had been transferred by the Hungarian government to a state company called Antenna Hungária Company. This is a legal operation, right? Well, afterwards, this company was registered as a private company, legally again, at a court, at a tribunal in Budapest. Well, it's a private company with one single owner. The owner is the Hungarian Republic, but the company is a private company over which the Hungarian Republic has no jurisdiction and no control. The board consists of people belonging to the dominant party in the Hungarian parliament, called by an oxymoron the Hungarian Democratic Forum. And and this company now, owned by the state, paid for by the state, but not controlled by the state as it exists as a democratic state, multi-party system, pluralism, constitution, and all this crap. Well, this company will now broadcast the views of some people in the Hungarian government, but a government which in the cosmos there, out there on the satellite, will not be opposed by any parliamentary opposition, because there is no opposition in the space. In the space there is only Churka. Now, this is what I dubbed in a newspaper article I wrote, the cosmic Churka. Now, so in a way, ladies and gentlemen, what we have instead of a private property-based market economy, what we have instead is the cosmic Churka, which can be more politely called the grey zone, or can be called the third way, and I prefer to keep it that way, because there might be people out there who haven't heard of my colleague and friend István Churka, the vice chairman of the oxymoronic and moronic government party. Now, so this is indeed the model of what we've got in Eastern Europe, ladies and gentlemen. This is economy run amok, outside any control, outside the control of the market, and outside of the control of the state. Controlled by self-appointed vigilante groups of whatever hue. These groups are called in Romania left-wing for some reason I can't really fathom, and that are called in Hungary right-wing for other equally mysterious reasons. I never thought that mafia has any particular political coloring. And, you know, mafia was never successful before. But what is mafia? Mafia is a state-like organization without popular mandate. Well, this is what East European economy is like. While everybody is speechifying here, ladies and gentlemen, about Europe, about European identity, about forging national identity into a European one, about going west and so on and so forth, which would be tragic if it weren't comical. Instead, the third way has triumphed. And while columnists in the Western papers are deploring the colonization, what occurred, and I don't know whether you heard of the American historian called Benjamin Barber, who said that there are two kinds of worlds nowadays. The one he calls jihad, which is what we have in the East and in the South, and the other is Macworld. And so Americans and Western pundits and columnists think that we have passed from the world of jihad into Macworld. Well, we haven't. We have passed, well, out, but in neither. We don't belong to Macworld and we don't belong to jihad. We belong to a third way. We belong to a state where there is no sovereignty, identifiable sovereignty. We don't know who the sovereign is. Well, there is no, because the parliament isn't the sovereign, is it? We don't know who the owners are. It's neither the state nor private owners. We don't know who the bosses are. We don't know who the citizens are. We don't know what the laws are. And we don't know where real power resides. And most importantly, we do not know where authority is, legal authority is. And in a vacuum created by not only perceived but a very real lack of authority, we have these people dressing up in Nazi uniforms or with these clanking medals of the Red Army in the Red Square, and the combination of the two, sometimes, in some countries. We have these people who are vociferating in the void, shouting themselves hoarse in their thirst and hunger for authority. They don't want power, they want to be dominated. They don't want to be the masters, they want to be the serfs. They want a lord, but there's no lord. There's no master, there's no lord, there's no domination, there's no authority, although they are willing victims of authority, willing servants of a new dictatorship, but no dictators. Tragic, isn't it? Now, we'd like to keep it this way. We'd like to keep it this way if we can't do better. We might want to do better, but we have to discover that what I call the third way, and by other names, is systemic. This is not an accident. This is not a quirk of history that happened only in Hungary, only in Czechoslovakia, only in Poland. No, this happens in such unimaginable places like the Ukraine and other very mysterious places. It has a systemic character. Eastern Europe had a social and political system of its own before. It has one now. Eastern Europe was different from Western Europe and from America and from the Third World before. It is still different. It is going its own way, which is not a way I particularly like, but it's ours, and so it should be cherished perhaps, but I can't bring myself to cherish it, but anyway, I might convince myself in the long run, and the skinheads might convince me even more forcibly to do it. But what we should and what we must indeed understand, that we are not free to choose between socialism and capitalism, between communism and liberalism. Things are not going in that absolutely random way, in that void of freedom we imagined, well, some of us imagined at any rate, to have inhabited in '89. We haven't inhabited it for a moment, but most certainly we don't inhabit it now. It is full, it is not empty. We are not free to move in what direction we might desire to move. This place of the world, this region of the world, has a character of its own. And this character can be summarized, well, it has many features. It can be summarized that this is a region of the world where the state is problematic, where citizenship is not taken for granted. Well, let me, to finish now, that's the last paragraph of an unwritten talk. Well, perhaps some of you know the famous remark of my favorite Prime Minister, Dr. Antal. Well, it's the only one I do have, so I prefer him to know Prime Ministers. So he had a famous remark about these 15 million Hungarians, right? Remember that he was in the inner depth of his soul and at the bottom of his heart, he was the Prime Minister of 15 million Hungarians. So some of you might know that Hungary has 10 million inhabitants. It's not a well-known fact, but it's a fact. Now, what does it mean? You know, people cursed Dr. Antal very unfairly, that he, by this remark, you know, wanted to change the borders of the country. One doesn't change borders by a remark. That's foolish. Well, the critics were foolish, I mean. And then he was accused that he was a nationalist. Well, nationalists don't say such things. But what does it mean? It means that the idea of nationhood is divorced from the idea of citizenship. If someone can't make up his mind whether he's the Prime Minister of his country or is the Prime Minister of something else, however respectable that else may be, well then there's trouble, isn't it? There's a lot of trouble. So if he doesn't know whose Prime Minister he is, who are we to know better? We don't. I don't. You don't. Nobody does. Well, when your president, Mr. Iliescu, who's not my favorite president, because we have many presidents, and I know better ones, like Mr. Liam here. But he suffers from the same syndrome. He doesn't know whose president he is. He knows Romanians who are not Romanian citizens, whose presidents he might become one day, weather and God permitting. Now, what does this all mean? This might only seem to you as only a rhetorical debate. It is not. In this place of the earth, people think, many people think, that to belong to a nation is a cultural, an ethnic, a racial, or a metaphysical idea. 4 days ago, Professor Jacques Derrida, who was in Budapest, reminded us that Fichte, in his famous work, Reden an die deutsche Nation, said that to be German is defined by a philosophy, as it happens by Johann Gottlob Fichte's philosophy, a philosophy of liberty. And those people who didn't believe in that philosophy weren't, in the truest sense, German. So Eskimos, French, and even, for God's sake, Hungarians, could be German if they appropriated, or in a Platonic sense participated in, Fichte's philosophy. And those unfortunate Deutsche, who were just empirically Deutsch, I mean, you know, just born German, speaking German, inhabiting German lands and other negligible little details of personal biography, well, those weren't in the truest and deepest sense German. Well, in a part of the world where people are really debating hotly whether they do belong or they don't belong to their political community, there you do not have political communities. Or you have too many or too few. I haven't made up my mind either whether we have too many or too few, but definitely not one which more fortunate people like the French, very exotic people to my mind, do have. In a region of the world, in an area where it's not clear whether we have a political community relating to a state, therefore whether we do have citizens or not, in a part of the world where we have huge economic organizations, we do not know who owns them, where we have political sovereigns who are not recognized by those who rule them. It was obscure, perhaps, what I said, but I alluded to East European parliaments whose authority is not recognized by the governments, the power of which is in principle derived from Parliament. And I want to be even more concrete. I alluded to my own government. It's trying to overrule Parliament every morning. So this is why we should be there all days, because we might look the other way and we are overruled. And to sum up and to finish, indeed, because I can feel without seeing that Mr. Lim is growing impatient, that, and rightly so, I think that the triumph of the third way is connected with the troubles we have traditionally and for a very long time with sovereignty, citizenship, statehood, and authority. These problems have troubled East and Central Europeans for centuries. These problems have inspired those very strange ideas of Fichte and Marx and others who tried to find sources of authority outside the state. And they did. And we do. Therefore, the idea that Eastern Europe is going in the direction of Western-style liberal democracy, of civic liberty, are just nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tamás. I believe there will be plenty of things to discuss.